There's a particular kind of feeling you get when you revisit something from childhood and realise it's stranger than you remembered. Not darker necessarily, though sometimes that too, just stranger. More layered, like finding a drawer in a house you grew up in that you never noticed before, and opening it to find it full of things that don't quite make sense. SpongeBob SquarePants is that drawer for me. I've been thinking about this show a lot lately, not in any serious academic way, more in the way you think about something when it keeps drifting back into your head at odd hours. You're making tea, and suddenly you're wondering what chum actually is. You're trying to fall asleep, and you find yourself quietly puzzling over why there's a squirrel living at the bottom of the ocean. Ordinary things, as you do. So I thought we'd spend some time here tonight, just wandering through Bikini Bottom and seeing what turns up. There's no particular destination. Some of what we'll talk about are proper fan theories with evidence and everything. Some of it is just me noticing things I'd never thought to question before. And some of it is genuinely unresolved, questions the show has been sitting on for 25 years without ever fully answering. It's a long video, that's kind of the point. Pour yourself something warm, get comfortable, and we'll just take our time with it. One thing worth saying at the start, if you're new here, this channel does a lot of these long, slow deep dives into shows and films and the odd corner of history. If that sounds like your kind of thing, it probably is. Subscribe and you'll get more of the same. Now let's get into it. The place to start, I think, is with the man who made the show. Because understanding who Stephen Hillenburg was tells you an enormous amount about why Bikini Bottom feels the way it does. Specific and strange and somehow real, even though nothing about it should be. Stephen Hillenburg was born in 1961 in Lawton, Oklahoma, which is a military town, Fort Sill specifically, an army base in the south of the state. His family moved to Anaheim, California when he was young, and that's where he grew up. Southern California in the 1960s and 70s, near the coast. If you're trying to imagine how someone ends up obsessed with the ocean, that's a reasonable starting point. He loved the films of Jacques Cousteau as a kid, which is something that keeps coming up whenever people write about him. And I think it's genuinely important rather than just a biographical detail. Cousteau's films from that era have a very specific quality. They're slow and quiet and full of wonder, and they treat the ocean as a place worth paying deep attention to. Not dramatic, not frightening, just endlessly interesting. That sensibility is absolutely in SpongeBob, underneath all the silliness. The show has always treated the ocean as somewhere worth caring about. Hillenburg went to Humboldt State University in Northern California and got a degree in natural resource planning and interpretation, with a focus on marine resources. Then, in 1984, he started teaching marine biology at the Orange County Marine Institute, now called the Ocean Institute, in Dana Point. He did that for 3 years, and while he was teaching, he made a comic book, a hand-drawn educational comic he used with his students, called The Intertidal Zone. It was about tide pool creatures, the things you find when the sea pulls back. Crabs, sea stars, sea anemones, snails, and a particular kind of sponge. If you read descriptions of that comic, the characters are recognizable. A crab, a starfish, a sponge, a squid-like creature. The DNA of SpongeBob was in a teacher's educational comic made for middle schoolers at a marine science institute. That's where it came from. In 1987, Hillenburg went back to school, to Cal Arts, the California Institute of the Arts, for a master's degree in experimental animation. He graduated in 1992 and moved into the industry, eventually landing on Rocko's Modern Life as a writer and director. Rocko ran from 1993 to 1996, and if you've ever wondered why early SpongeBob has a particular anarchic quality that later seasons don't quite capture, some of that comes from Hillenburg spending 3 years on a show that was deliberately subversive and weird. He pitched SpongeBob to Nickelodeon in 1997 using a handmade storyboard and an actual fish tank to illustrate what Bikini Bottom would look like. The story goes that he brought the tank into the pitch meeting and described each character's world as he pointed at it. The executives said yes. The show was almost called SpongeBoy. Hillenburg's original name for the character was SpongeBoy Happy Pants, which is quite the name. It had to be changed because SpongeBoy was already trademarked by a mop company, of all things. So he became SpongeBob. The SquarePants part was Nickelodeon's idea, added because it was funnier and more distinctive. Hillenburg wasn't thrilled about it at first, apparently. He came around. The show premiered on May 1, 1999, and it was an immediate success. It became one of the highest-rated series in Nickelodeon's history and one of the longest-running American animated shows ever made. Here's a detail I find interesting, though. In 2004, Hillenburg made the first SpongeBob movie and intended it as a series finale. He wanted to end the show there, with the movie, and move on. Nickelodeon wanted more. Hillenburg resigned as showrunner rather than continue under those terms, and the show carried on without him in the lead role. There is a very noticeable shift in SpongeBob's tone after the first movie. The first 3 seasons have a kind of focused, strange warmth to them. Characters feel consistent, plots are odd in ways that feel intentional, and there's a real sense of a world with rules, even if those rules are absurd. From season 4 onward, the show becomes broader, louder, more reliant on slapstick and gross-out humour, and the characters' personalities sometimes feel inconsistent in ways they didn't before. Fans have debated when the show went downhill for years. The answer, if there is one, maps almost exactly onto Hillenburg stepping back. He did return. In 2014, he came back to the show in an executive capacity and worked on it until his death. He passed away on the 26th of November 2018 from ALS, motor neurone disease. He was 57. I think the reason his background matters so much is this. SpongeBob SquarePants is built on actual love for the ocean. Hillenburg taught tide pool ecology. He understood how these creatures actually lived, how they related to each other, what their environments looked like. He said once that working at the Marine Institute showed him how fascinated children are with undersea life, particularly tide pool creatures, and that fascination was something he wanted to bring into animation. That explains why the show, at its best, feels grounded in something real. The creatures are exaggerated, obviously, but the way they inhabit their world, the way Bikini Bottom has texture and geography and a specific underwater quality, comes from someone who had actually spent years paying attention to what lives at the bottom of the sea. Something I find genuinely affecting about Hillenburg's story is the particular path he took to get where he ended up. He didn't start as an animation person. He started as a scientist who happened to also draw. The Intertidal Zone, the comic he made for his Marine Institute students, wasn't made with any commercial ambition. It was a teaching tool. He was trying to help children remember what a hermit crab was, what a sea anemone did, why the tide coming in and out mattered. The comic was just a way to make that information stick. There's a version of Stephen Hillenburg who teaches marine biology for his whole career, and the comic stays in a drawer somewhere in Dana Point. That version didn't happen, but the version that did happen carries the DNA of the teaching version throughout. SpongeBob SquarePants, at its core, is still a show made by someone who wanted children to find the ocean interesting. The humour, the absurdism, the silliness, all of that is the packaging. Inside the packaging is someone who spent 3 years showing 8-year-olds tide pools and watching their faces light up. The influence of Rocko's modern life on SpongeBob is worth dwelling on for a moment. Rocko ran from 1993 to 1996 and was, at the time, one of the stranger things on American children's television. It was full of adult subtext, visual gags that only adults would catch, and a general willingness to be weird in ways that didn't entirely make sense for its target audience. Hillenburg worked on Rocko as a writer and director, and that experience of making something that worked on multiple levels simultaneously, funny for kids on the surface, doing something stranger underneath, clearly carried through into SpongeBob. The early SpongeBob episodes have a quality that's difficult to pin down, but very easy to feel. They're genuinely strange. Not in a show-offy way, not in the way that later seasons sometimes are, where the weirdness is the point. In the early seasons, the weirdness is just there in the background, part of the texture. It's the weirdness of someone who finds tide pools and deep-sea creatures inherently fascinating and assumes you do too, and builds a show on that assumption. Hillenburg was reportedly uncomfortable with the extent of SpongeBob's merchandising. The character appearing on everything from lunchboxes to sneakers to hotel rooms. He worried about what that kind of saturation did to the integrity of what he'd made. This is a fairly common concern among creators when their work goes very big, but it's particularly interesting in Hillenburg's case given that SpongeBob began as an educational tool. A teaching aid that becomes a global brand is a significant journey, and Hillenburg made it while being somewhat uneasy about the destination. He also, famously, opposed any spin-off series. He said publicly that he had no interest in seeing SpongeBob babies or any prequel or sequel or extended universe content. After his death, Nickelodeon announced Camp Coral, a prequel spin-off set during the characters' childhoods, and The Patrick Star Show. Both have aired. Whether you think that's a betrayal of his intentions or a natural consequence of him no longer being there to prevent it, probably depends on how you feel about authorial intent as a concept. What I keep coming back to is the fish tank at the pitch meeting. He brought a fish tank to explain his idea, setting up a physical, tangible model of the underwater world he wanted to create. Real water, real objects, the characters described by pointing at where they'd live, rather than by describing them in the abstract. A marine biology teacher's instinct carried into a pitch meeting. The simplest possible way of saying here, this is the place, these are the creatures, this is what I mean. Which naturally brings us to what exactly is at the bottom of the sea beneath Bikini Bottom. And the answer turns out to be more interesting than the name suggests. Bikini Atoll is a real place. It's in the Marshall Islands, in the Pacific Ocean, roughly halfway between Hawaii and Papua New Guinea. It's a coral reef, a ring of islands surrounding a lagoon, and for centuries it was home to a small indigenous population, the Bikinian people, who had lived there for generations. In 1946, the United States government asked the Bikinians to leave temporarily. The US had recently ended the Second World War by dropping nuclear bombs on Japan and was now interested in understanding what those weapons did to ships, to structures, to living things when detonated at various altitudes and depths. Bikini Atoll, remote and beautiful and largely unknown to the outside world, seemed like a suitable place to find out. The Bikinian people were told the tests were for the good of mankind. They were told they could return when it was over. They agreed to leave because the king of Bikini, a man named Judah, consulted with his community and decided to trust the Americans. They were relocated to a different island, which turned out to be barely habitable and unable to support them. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll. Some were detonated above the water, some were detonated below it. The largest, the Castle Bravo test of 1954, produced an explosion equivalent to roughly 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. It destroyed 3 islands and contaminated an enormous area of the Pacific. The fallout drifted over nearby atolls and irradiated their populations, leading to serious health consequences that continued for generations. A Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was in the vicinity and its crew suffered acute radiation sickness. The Bikinian people were returned to their islands in the late 1960s, after the US government declared it safe. In 1978, they were evacuated again, because it turned out not to be safe. They had ingested more radioactive cesium from the environment than almost any known human population. They have never been able to return permanently. Their islands remain contaminated. Bikini Bottom is named after Bikini Atoll. This isn't a theory. Hillenburg confirmed it, and the connection is obvious. The show is set beneath the atoll, at the bottom of the sea, but the fan theory that's been circulating for years goes further than just the name. It says that the reason Bikini Bottom exists, the reason sea creatures there can talk, can work, can drive boats and cook burgers and go to school, is that nuclear testing mutated them. The radiation didn't kill everything, it transformed it. In December 2024, during a cast reunion video for Esquire magazine, a journalist asked the cast about this theory. Roger Bumpass, who voices Squidward, said he'd always liked it. And then Mr. Lawrence, who has both voiced Plankton and written for the show for decades, said simply, "And that is true. That is absolutely true." He went further. He described the show as representing the theoretical results of the real-world testing, and suggested the setting is something like a post-apocalyptic world, a world transformed by nuclear events, rather than destroyed by them. This is a confirmed canonical fact now, in the sense that a writer on the show has confirmed it. Hillenburg never said it directly, but he also planted enough breadcrumbs that it's hard to believe it was accidental. Every large explosion in the show, and there are many, produces a mushroom cloud that mirrors the specific shape of the Bikini Atoll detonation photographs. That detail is not coincidental. There's also the matter of the real marine life at Bikini Atoll now. A 2017 study by Stanford marine biologist Steve Palumbi found that the crater left by one of the nuclear tests is teeming with marine life. Corals, fish, sharks. The original populations are long gone, but new creatures have moved in. Mutations have been observed. A nurse shark that typically has 2 dorsal fins was found there with only 1. The ecosystem is alive, but it's different. Changed. The chipmunks on ships theory is a smaller detail that I find oddly compelling. During the nuclear tests, various animals were placed aboard Navy vessels and monitored for the effects of radiation exposure. Rats, pigs, goats, and some reports mention smaller rodents. Some fans have pointed to this as the in-universe explanation for Sandy, a squirrel or squirrel ancestor who ended up in the radioactive Pacific and whose descendants eventually adapted. The show never confirms this, but Sandy, being a land creature who's made her life permanently underwater in a suit with no obvious plan to go back, does raise the question of what she's doing there in the first place. We'll get into that more later. The thing I keep coming back to with the nuclear theory is that it makes Bikini Bottom a sadder place without making it a worse show. The backstory, a real place, real displacement, real contamination, gives the world weight. It also means that every absurd, cheerful thing that happens in Bikini Bottom is happening in the shadow of something genuinely awful. The characters don't know about it mostly. They just live there, in a world shaped by something they didn't cause and can't undo. That's a strange thing to build a children's cartoon around. But then, so was SpongeBob's creator. The Castle Bravo test of 1954 is the one that really matters in terms of scale. It was the largest nuclear weapon the United States ever detonated, and it was substantially more powerful than predicted. The scientists calculated a yield of around 6 megatons and got 15. The reasons for this miscalculation have to do with the behaviour of lithium-7 under specific conditions, which the weapons designers hadn't accounted for. That kind of error at that scale is, I find, one of the more quietly horrifying details in the history of nuclear testing. The fallout from Castle Bravo contaminated an enormous area. It reached the Marshall Islands. It reached the crew of the Lucky Dragon No. 5. It drifted. Radioactive coral dust rained down on inhabited islands. People were not warned. The Japanese fishermen on the Lucky Dragon, who were well outside the designated danger zone, came home sick with radiation poisoning. One of them died. In Japan, this history fed into Godzilla. The 1954 film, released the same year as Castle Bravo, is explicitly a response to nuclear testing. A monster awakened from the ocean by nuclear detonation, enormous and unstoppable, as much a symbol of the anxiety around nuclear power as a piece of entertainment. Godzilla and SpongeBob, two enormous cultural phenomena born from the same set of events in the same part of the ocean. One is a horror story, the other is a comedy. That's a rather striking divergence. The shape of the Bikini Atoll explosions became iconic. Photographs of the tests show mushroom clouds that have a particular character. The underwater Baker test produced an enormous column of water and steam that photographs in a way that's genuinely beautiful in a horrifying way. The Baker test in particular, which was detonated underwater in the lagoon, produced a dome of water rising around the column that looks like something from another world. In SpongeBob, every major explosion produces a mushroom cloud that mirrors this specific shape. It's a recurring visual motif embedded so deeply in the show's DNA that most viewers never notice it consciously. Roger Bumpass, hearing Mr. Lawrence confirm the nuclear theory in the 2024 Esquire video, sounded genuinely surprised. "It is true," he said, which suggests that not everyone on the show knew exactly what the official position was on this. Lawrence was definitive. Yes, absolutely, the show is set in the aftermath of real nuclear testing. The fact that a main cast member, someone who has been with the show since 1999, didn't know this for certain until 2024, says something interesting about how this kind of foundational creative decision can exist in a show without being universally communicated. The broader implications of the confirmed theory are worth sitting with. If Bikini Bottom exists because nuclear testing mutated the sea life beneath Bikini Atoll, then the show is set in a world fundamentally shaped by human error and human violence. The cheerful suburban community, the Krusty Krab, the boating school, the retirement home, all of it sits on top of a history of displacement and contamination. The Bikinian people lost their home forever so that the world SpongeBob SquarePants inhabits could exist. That's not the show's subject matter, but it's the show's foundation. Hillenburg was an environmentalist. He spent years teaching people to care about the ocean. He received an award from a non-profit called Heal the Bay for his work spreading awareness about aquatic life. The choice to name his show's setting after one of the most contaminated places on Earth is, in that context, not a casual decision. This is one of those questions that sounds simpler than it turns out to be. SpongeBob is a sea sponge. His creator was a marine biologist. So you'd expect the biology to be at least somewhat grounded, even if it's a cartoon. And in some ways it is, but the gaps between real sponge biology and SpongeBob's behaviour are interesting in themselves. Real sea sponges are sessile filter feeders. They don't move. They don't have brains, nervous systems, eyes, or any of the internal organs you'd associate with an animal that can have opinions and cook a burger. They sit on the ocean floor, draw water in through tiny pores, filter out nutrients, and expel the water back out. That's the whole thing. A sea sponge has more in common with a plant, functionally, than with the vertebrates we tend to think of as animals. SpongeBob does retain some biological sponge properties. He can absorb water. In several episodes, he swells up when waterlogged. He can be wrung out, squeezed, compressed, and springs back to his original shape. In at least one episode, he tears off a piece of himself and it regrows. That last one is actually biologically accurate. Real sponges can regenerate from fragments, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. But he also has bones. There's an episode where Sandy and Patrick see SpongeBob's skeleton, which exists and is anatomically bizarre. He has internal organs that have been shown in various episodes. A brain, what appears to be a stomach, some vague suggestion of a circulatory system. He cries, he sweats, he can be sick. None of this is even slightly possible for a real sponge. Hillenburg's intention, I think, was to take the form of a sea sponge, The visual shape, the absorbent quality, the texture, and put a character inside it who could do cartoon things. He wasn't trying to be biologically faithful. He was a marine biologist who wanted to make people fond of a kind of creature they'd normally overlook. There's actually a distinction worth drawing here. SpongeBob's design is based on a natural sea sponge, not the synthetic kitchen sponge you'd use to do the washing up. But because he's square and yellow with holes in him, he looks a lot more like a kitchen sponge than a natural one. Hillenburg reportedly found this amusing. The ambiguity was fine by him. Tom Kenny, who has voiced SpongeBob since the beginning, said at the 2024 Motor City Comic Con that he thinks of SpongeBob as autistic. He didn't say it was ever written that way explicitly, just that it's the framework he's always used to understand the character. SpongeBob's earnestness, his hyper-focus on his job, his difficulty reading social situations when they become complicated, his deep need for specific routines and relationships. Kenny said autistic people he's spoken with often feel recognized by the character. That tracks with how the show presents SpongeBob. He's not stupid. He's extraordinarily good at what he does. The fry cooking is genuine skill, and he's never portrayed as bad at it. He's emotionally intelligent in specific interpersonal ways. But he struggles with ambiguity, with conflict, with situations where the rules are unclear. He takes things literally. He is, as Kenny describes him, a character who experiences the world very intensely and very sincerely. The square shape is worth a mention too. Sea sponges are not square. Hillenburg wanted a shape that was immediately distinctive, something you'd recognize in a silhouette. A square, slightly porous, with big eyes and a gap-toothed smile. It works because it's simple and strange simultaneously, which is roughly what SpongeBob himself is. One more thing. Real sea sponges produce chemical compounds that have genuine pharmaceutical interest. Some of the most promising anti-cancer compounds we've found have come from marine sponges. There's a whole field of research into sponge-derived medicines. Hillenburg probably knew this. It's the kind of thing a marine biology teacher would know. And there's something a bit funny about the fact that one of the world's most cheerful fictional characters is based on an animal that might actually save lives. The pharmaceutical connection is something I find genuinely interesting, and that doesn't come up much in SpongeBob discussions. Marine sponges are among the most chemically complex organisms in the ocean. They produce a remarkable variety of compounds, many of which have turned out to be medically significant. Cytarabine, a drug used to treat leukemia, was originally derived from a Caribbean sponge. The sponge as an organism is essentially a chemical factory, producing compounds that either defend it from predators or help it compete for space on the reef. There's a faint irony in the fact that SpongeBob, the most cheerful and uncomplicated character in the show, is based on a creature that produces some of the most medically complex natural chemistry we've found. The question of what SpongeBob's biology actually is within the show gets stranger the more episodes you watch. He has been squeezed through small spaces, inflated, deflated, divided into pieces, merged with other characters, and subjected to physical transformations that suggest his body has no fixed properties whatsoever. In one episode, he tears himself apart, and the pieces all become independent SpongeBobs, each with the same personality. In another, he's shrunk to microscopic size. In another, he can stretch to enormous proportions. The show treats his body as plastic in a way that goes beyond cartoon elasticity. SpongeBob's physical form is genuinely undefined at a fundamental level. This actually fits with real sponge biology in a specific way. Real sponges don't have a fixed form in the way that, say, a crab has a fixed form. Sponges can merge with each other. Two sponges of the same species placed in contact will often fuse into a single organism. They can be passed through a fine mesh, disaggregating into individual cells, and the cells will find each other and reassemble into a functioning sponge. Their identity as individuals is more flexible than most animals. SpongeBob's similarly flexible, physical identity might be a nod to this. even if the show doesn't make it explicit. Tom Kenny has voiced SpongeBob for 25 years now and has spoken about how the character sounds in his head versus how other people understand him. He describes SpongeBob as someone who is always completely sincere, who has no irony in him, who says what he means and means what he says. In a television landscape that for many years was fairly saturated with ironic, detached, knowing characters, the 1990s and early 2000s were full of this. SpongeBob's sincerity was genuinely unusual. He was a throwback to a kind of cartoon character that felt almost old-fashioned. SpongeBob lives in a pineapple under the sea. This is the first thing most people know about him. It's in the theme song. But why? Why a pineapple? And why does that detail feel so right for the character when you think about it? Hillenburg's explanation, which he gave in a few different interviews, was that he started by designing a set of possible houses for the characters and then asked himself what each character would choose if given the options. He laid out a rock, a pineapple, an Easter Island head, and an old rubber boot, and asked which one would SpongeBob pick. He said SpongeBob would choose the pineapple because he's an optimist and because he would like the smell, which is both the most on-brand possible reason and completely charming. The rock, obviously, went to Patrick, the Easter Island head to Squidward. The rubber boot, apparently, just never ended up assigned to anyone, which feels right. Some housing options are just unfortunate. The pineapple choice makes more sense when you know that SpongeBob's design draws heavily on Polynesian culture and aesthetic. Hillenburg was inspired by Pacific Island art, Hawaiian motifs, Polynesian fabric patterns. Pineapples are a recurring symbol in that visual tradition, associated with hospitality and warmth. The show's whole visual palette, the flower-shaped objects floating above Bikini Bottom, the particular colour combinations, the cheerful geometric quality of everything, it's all rooted in that Pacific Island aesthetic. The in-universe explanation, given in the episode Truth or Square, is that a pineapple fell off a passing ship and landed in Squidward's garden, which is also presented as the reason Squidward has been annoyed at SpongeBob since before they even met. SpongeBob's house destroyed Squidward's garden before SpongeBob ever moved in. That's a rather elegant piece of retroactive backstory, actually. There's a mathematical wrinkle to the pineapple, if you're the sort of person who finds that interesting. A YouTuber named vHeart, who does brilliant videos about mathematics and patterns in nature, once analysed the spiral structure on SpongeBob's pineapple and found that it doesn't follow the Fibonacci sequence that real pineapple skin follows. Real pineapples have scales arranged in spirals that follow a specific mathematical ratio. It's the same pattern you see in sunflowers and pine cones, called a philotactic spiral. SpongeBob's pineapple doesn't have this. Its spirals are irregular, which could mean it's an artificial pineapple, manufactured rather than grown, which would fit with it having fallen off a ship. Or it could just mean the background artists didn't consult a botanist when drawing the house. Squidward's Easter Island head is worth a moment's thought. Easter Island moai, the famous stone statues, were carved to honour and preserve the spirits of the dead. They're essentially memorials, and Squidward, who spends the show wanting to be celebrated for his art and his talent and consistently failing to be recognised for either, lives inside a monument to honouring people who no longer exist. There might not be anything intentional in that, but it's a detail that sits in a slightly uncomfortable way once you notice it. Patrick's rock is the simplest of the three homes, and also the strangest, because the show can never quite decide what's underneath it. In some episodes, lifting Patrick's rock reveals bare sand and nothing else. He sleeps on the ground, with no furniture, no electricity, nothing. In other episodes, his rock contains a living room, a TV, a staircase, a basement, and various rooms that couldn't possibly fit under the rock's footprint. In Shell Games, it's revealed that Patrick's rock is taken by a turtle who uses it as his shell. The turtle, named Tony, starts living there after he takes it. This is presented as a revelation and then never mentioned again. Patrick's house, being whatever the episode needs it to be, is either a continuity failure or the most honest possible depiction of Patrick Starr's inner world, which seems to operate on similarly flexible rules. The house design process Hillenburg described, laying out options and asking which character would choose which one, is a very specific kind of creative methodology. It's character-driven rather than design-driven. You're not choosing a house and then building a character to fit it. You're building the character first and then asking what they'd naturally inhabit. This approach produces very different results than starting with an aesthetic and fitting characters into it. The result is that every house on Conch Street makes complete intuitive sense for its resident. Patrick's rock is nothing. Patrick is nothing in the best possible way. He has no ambitions, no possessions, no particular needs, beyond shelter and proximity to SpongeBob. A rock is exactly the right amount of house for Patrick. Squidward's Easter Island head is imposing and self-important and ancient and slightly threatening. It's the house a character would choose if they wanted their home to communicate something about their own cultural significance. And the pineapple is cheerful and warm and slightly absurd and smells nice. SpongeBob, precisely. What I find charming about the Polynesian design connection is that Hillenburg was drawing on a specific cultural aesthetic to make a show about an underwater world, and the Polynesian Hawaiian aesthetic he chose already had a deep relationship with the Pacific Ocean. It's not a random choice. The Pacific Islander visual tradition, the patterns, the motifs, the relationship between land and sea and sky, comes from people who lived with the ocean as a fundamental presence in their lives. Bringing those visual elements into a show set on the floor of the Pacific feels like a genuine gesture of respect for that relationship, even if most viewers watching the show had no idea where the flower shapes and the warm colour palette were coming from. The Easter Island moai deserve a bit more attention. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, to use its proper name, is in the southeastern Pacific, and its moai are among the most famous archaeological mysteries in the world. Hundreds of enormous stone statues, many of them transported kilometres from the quarry where they were carved, arranged in specific configurations around the island. Their purpose was to honour and preserve the spirits of important ancestors. They were not just monuments, but active spiritual presences, believed to protect the communities near them. Squidward's house is one of these statues. The implication, if you follow it, is that Squidward has made his home inside a memorial to someone who mattered, someone whose life was significant enough to commemorate in stone. And Squidward, who desperately wants to be the kind of person whose life is significant, who wants recognition and celebration, and to have his contributions acknowledged, lives inside the physical expression of someone else's cultural importance. He inherited the monument without being the person it was for. There might not be anything intentional in that reading, but it's a particularly melancholy detail for a character whose defining quality is melancholy. The question of the boot, the fourth housing option that Hillenburg laid out, is a minor one, but I like it. The rock, the pineapple, the Easter Island head, all of these ended up assigned to main characters. The boot didn't. The show has no recurring character who lives in a boot. Maybe nobody chose it. Maybe the character who would have lived there just didn't make the cut. Or maybe Hillenburg kept the boot in reserve and never needed it. Squidward is, technically, an octopus. His name has squid in it. He is consistently called an octopus within the show, and he has 6 limbs rather than 8, because the animators made a decision early on that drawing 8 limbs was too complicated and stuck with it. He is named Squidward because Hillenburg thought Octaward sounded strange, which it does admittedly. I find Squidward the most interesting character in the show to think about. Not because he's the funniest, he isn't usually, but because what the show is doing with him is more complex than it first appears. Squidward believes he's talented. He plays the clarinet constantly. He paints, he sculpts, he dances. He has devoted enormous amounts of his life to artistic self-expression. and virtually everyone around him finds his work terrible. His clarinet playing in particular is treated as one of the show's reliable sources of misery, a sound so unpleasant that it physically affects the people nearby. But here's the complication. Occasionally, the show lets Squidward be good. Band Geeks, which first aired in September 2001 and is consistently ranked among the greatest episodes the show ever produced, ends with Squidward conducting his neighbourhood band at a halftime show and pulling off a genuinely moving performance. The crowd goes wild. Squidward stands there in the moment of his triumph, and it's played sincerely. Not as a joke, he really did it. The implication is that Squidward is capable of the thing he wants to be capable of. He's not deluded about having some talent, he has it. It's just usually not accessible because of his anxiety and his ego and the environment he's trapped in. The capacity is there, the conditions are wrong. Roger Bumpass, who voices Squidward and has done so since 1999, has described the character as someone who is profoundly unhappy but hasn't fully admitted it to himself yet. He's created an elaborate self-image, the misunderstood artist, the cultured individual surrounded by Philistines that protects him from having to confront the fact that he's spending his days working a job he finds beneath him, next to neighbours who exhaust him, in a town that has never recognised what he thinks he deserves. The show plays this for comedy, mostly, but the comedy has an uncomfortable edge if you watch it as an adult. The episodes where SpongeBob and Patrick genuinely ruin something Squidward cared about, not through malice, just through the collateral damage of being themselves. Those ones land differently than they did when I was 8. What the show consistently does with Squidward is give him enough self-awareness to know he's unhappy, and not quite enough to know what to do about it. He understands that he's stuck. He doesn't understand that staying is a choice he keeps making. He blames his neighbours for his circumstances, and they do contribute to his circumstances, but they're not the whole story. The whole story is a character who has defined himself by what he hasn't achieved, and who organises his self-image around the gap between where he is and where he imagined he'd be. There's something to be said about the staying. Squidward could leave Bikini Bottom. There's plenty keeping him there. Family, deep roots shown, and particular obligations. He stays. He stays in a house on a street between two neighbours he can barely tolerate, working a job at a fast food restaurant, because moving requires accepting that this is what his life is and doing something about it. The staying is the most human thing about him. The specific episodes that develop Squidward most fully are worth mentioning because they show the show at its most genuinely complex. Squid's Visit is an episode where SpongeBob rearranges his house to look exactly like Squidward's in an attempt to get Squidward to come over. Squidward initially refuses, but eventually enters, and there's a sequence where he walks through SpongeBob's replica of his own home, and the experience is deeply unsettling for him. He's confronted with a perfect copy of his space, done by someone who cares about him enough to reproduce every detail, and his response is confusion and discomfort, rather than warmth. The episode is played for horror movie tension more than comedy, and it lands that way. Squidward doesn't know how to receive care. The camping episode gives Squidward an unexpected moment of competence. He lectures SpongeBob and Patrick at length about safe camping practices, is ignored, and the sea bear, an inexplicable creature that attacks people for arbitrary reasons, terrorizes everyone in accordance with its bizarre but specific behavior patterns. Squidward, who follows none of the correct safety procedures and does everything wrong, is repeatedly attacked. SpongeBob and Patrick, who follow all the rules exactly, are not attacked at all. The episode ends with Squidward mauled anyway, by a different creature he hadn't been warned about. It's a darkly funny episode about the relationship between following rules and actually being safe, and it gives Squidward a strange dignity for most of its runtime before pulling the rug. Roger Bumpass has been playing Squidward since 1999, which means he's been embodying this specific kind of thwarted ambition for 25 years. Bumpass is himself a working voice actor who has had a long career without necessarily the kind of recognition that would satisfy Squidward. It's the kind of parallel that's probably not worth pushing too hard, but it does suggest that Bumpass might have a particular understanding of the character's frustrations. The clarinet as a character choice keeps nagging at me. Hillenburg chose the clarinet for Squidward over the guitar or piano or violin, instruments with more obvious cultural associations with artistic sophistication or emotional depth. The clarinet occupies a strange middle ground. It's genuinely classical. Mozart, Brahms, Gershwin wrote clarinet parts of real beauty. But it's also the instrument most associated with comedy when played badly, with the squawk and shriek that Squidward's playing produces. It's an instrument that can be either magnificent or catastrophic, with very little in between. That's essentially Squidward's whole arc. Most people who watch this show as children identified with SpongeBob. He's the protagonist, he's cheerful, he's enthusiastic, but watching it as an adult, Squidward is suddenly the character who makes the most sense. He's trying to do something with his life, and it keeps not working out. There's something in that. The surface-level SpongeBob plot is about Plankton trying to steal the Krabby Patty formula. Every few episodes, Plankton comes up with a new scheme. The scheme fails, Mr. Krabs wins, Plankton goes back to the chum bucket, and we start again. It's a comfortable cycle, the kind of recurring structure that sitcoms use to give audiences a sense of continuity. But the actual emotional centre of that storyline, the thing that makes it interesting rather than just repetitive, is that Mr. Krabs and Plankton used to be best friends, and neither of them has gotten over what happened between them. The episode that tells this story is Friend or Foe, which aired in April 2007 as the premiere of Season 5. It's structured around 3 unreliable accounts. Mr. Krabs tells SpongeBob his version of the story, Plankton tells his version, and then Karen, Plankton's computer wife, who is present and has the whole thing on record in her database, tells what actually happened. The real story, according to Karen, Krabs and Plankton grew up together, both bullied at school, and found each other as outcasts. They became close friends. As young men, they decided to go into business together, making burgers to compete with a local restaurant called Stinky Burgers. They worked on the formula together. Their first customer, Old Man Jenkins, tried their creation and was immediately poisoned by it. The original patty was awful. They accused each other of sabotaging the recipe, got into a physical fight, and tore the formula in half. Plankton stormed out with the bottom half of the page, which read, "and a pinch of chum." As he left, a shelf collapsed, and various random ingredients fell into the batter, accidentally creating what became the Krabby Patty recipe. Krabs was left with that version, and the rest is history. Plankton's half of the formula, the only part he ever had, was the chum ingredient. He has been cooking the failure half of their shared creation for his entire adult life. This is, when you sit with it, quite sad. The chum bucket sits directly across the street from the Krusty Krab. This is the show's geography. They are literally facing each other. So every single day, Plankton looks out of his failing restaurant at the thriving success of the thing he helped build, and he experiences it as an ongoing loss that he can't stop returning to. Plankton regularly moves away from the chum bucket. He doesn't reinvent. He keeps trying to steal back the part of the formula that should have been his in the first place, which from his perspective is entirely reasonable. Karen is named after Hillenburg's real wife, Karen Umland, who he married in 1998. Plankton built Karen, literally constructed a computer and made her his companion. The show plays this as slightly pathetic and slightly sweet in equal measure. But the detail that Plankton built his own companion because he had no one else is something that sits differently once you know the friendship backstory. He lost his best friend, he built a replacement. There's one more thing about the end of Friend or Foe that's worth noting. Karen tells the true story, and Krabs and Plankton hear it together. They both tear up. They hug. Plankton says that all he's ever wanted is to get their friendship back the way it used to be, and then he immediately tries to steal the formula again before the embrace is even finished. The episode doesn't resolve this as a joke about Plankton's untrustworthiness. It plays it as something more complicated, a man who genuinely misses his friend and is also constitutionally incapable of stopping the thing that destroyed the friendship. The conflict is an addiction. The rivalry is grief. The three unreliable narrator structure of friend or foe is one of the more sophisticated narrative choices the show ever made. Mr. Krabs tells his version, Plankton tells his version, and both versions are flattering to the teller and unfair to the other party, in exactly the way that people retell old arguments. Each of them remembers himself as the reasonable one. Each of them has constructed a narrative in which he was wronged rather than wrong. And then Karen gives the actual account. Karen was there. Karen has it recorded. And what Karen's version makes clear is that they were both wrong, and they both know it on some level, and neither of them has been able to admit it for decades. The specific trigger for the friendship's collapse, a fight over a recipe that ripped in half, is small in the way that the triggering events of long-standing estrangements often are. It's rarely the catastrophic thing that ends a close friendship. It's usually something specific and symbolic, something that stands in for a larger disagreement about values or priorities. The recipe was the symbol of their shared ambition. Tearing it apart was a way of tearing apart the thing they'd built together. Krabs kept the working half, and Plankton kept the failure half, and neither of them has acknowledged, in over 25 years of episodes, that this is ultimately a story about two people who missed each other. The moment near the end of Friend or Foe where they hug while crying is genuine. The show plays it sincerely. Karen is moved, SpongeBob is moved, and Plankton, in the same movement, uses the embrace to grab the formula and run. He can't help it. He misses his friend, and he can't stop being the person who would steal from his friend. These things coexist and neither cancels the other out. Karen the computer deserves more attention than she usually gets in fan discussions. She was built by Plankton. He assembled her intelligence, her voice, her personality, out of technology he made himself. She is his creation, which gives their relationship a particular dynamic that's unusual for a marriage, even a cartoon marriage. She's sharper than he is in most episodes, more realistic about their prospects, quicker to point out when his plans are failing. She expresses what reads as genuine exasperation with his Krabby Patty obsession. She calls him on his nonsense. The detail that Hillenburg named Karen after his real wife, who he married in 1998, a year before the show premiered, is one of those facts that shifts how you see the character slightly. Plankton's Karen is more competent than her husband and more clear-eyed about what's actually happening, and she's named after the creator's wife. There are various ways to read that. The Krabby Patty secret formula is the show's most sustained mystery. It has been driving the plot for over 25 years and has never been resolved. The bottle exists, it has been glimpsed, characters have gone to enormous lengths to protect it or steal it, and its full contents remain officially unknown. What we know in the episode Patty Caper, Plankton reveals that he has worked out every single ingredient in the Krabby Patty formula except one. He's gone through ingredients starting with A and reached R before being stumped. The secret ingredient starts with a letter between R and Z. The episode also shows a close-up of the formula bottle with a large X visible on it, which fans have taken to suggest the secret ingredient starts with X, though that could easily be coincidental. Plankton's test that episode involves raw sewage, for context, so the letter R wasn't giving him much to work with. The cast has been asked about this repeatedly over the years. Tom Kenny, SpongeBob's voice, said in one interview that he's fairly confident the formula doesn't contain fish, because that would be cannibalism, he said. He seemed amused by the question. It's a funny line, but it also raises an interesting point that the show doesn't address directly. Bikini Bottom is populated by fish and sea creatures who eat Krabby Patties, which are made of some kind of patty. What that patty is made of is never specified. The The show sidesteps the question entirely. Carolyn Lawrence, who voices Sandy, said she thinks the secret ingredient is love. Specifically, the love SpongeBob puts into the cooking. She acknowledged it sounds a bit naff, but she was sincere about it. And actually, the show does support this reading. There are episodes where other characters cook Krabby Patties using the same formula, and they don't taste the same. The formula without SpongeBob produces an inferior product. Whatever the ingredients are, the cook seems to matter more. This creates an interesting wrinkle in the backstory, because Sponge on the Run and the Camp Coral spin-offs establish that SpongeBob invented the formula as a child, which contradicts Friend or Foe, where crabs and plankton created it together. The show's own backstory for its central MacGuffin doesn't hold together under scrutiny. Hillenburg, who famously didn't care much about continuity, would probably have found this argument amusing. My own feeling, for what it's worth, is that the secret formula works best as an unanswered question. The whole structure of the crabs-plankton dynamic depends on the formula being worth stealing, and the worth of a thing that everyone wants but nobody can access is inherently higher than the worth of a thing that's been explained. The moment you reveal what's in the bottle, the story is over. Some mysteries are doing more work as mysteries than they would as answers. The episode structure around the formula has become one of SpongeBob's defining running gags, and it's worth thinking about what makes it work as a structure across 25 years of repetition. Most TV gags wear out. The formula hasn't quite. I think the reason is that the formula is always secondary to the relationship. Plankton's attempts to steal the Krabby Patty formula are really stories about plankton and crabs, about the push and pull between them, about what plankton will do and what crabs will do in response, about the specific dynamic of two people who know each other very well and are using that knowledge against each other. The formula is just the thing that structures that relationship into episodes. The question of what love means as a secret ingredient, which Carolyn Lawrence suggested, and which has some canonical support, is actually a fairly old idea in food culture. There's a long tradition of claiming that the key to a recipe is some intangible quality that can't be listed or measured. Grandmother's cooking in the stories people tell is always attributed to some mysterious quality that died with the grandmother. What Lawrence is suggesting is that SpongeBob's fry cooking is in that tradition. The formula is real, the ingredients are real, but the thing that makes the patties what they are is something about SpongeBob specifically. The intent, the care, the sincerity. This connects back to what Tom Kenny says about SpongeBob's character. He's completely sincere. He means everything he does. And the patties carry that somehow in a way that doesn't survive being replicated by anyone who doesn't have that same quality of attention. There's one more thing about the formula worth mentioning. In a late episode, the formula is briefly shown to have a notation for a pinch of chum crossed out. This confirms the friend or foe backstory. Chum was part of the original recipe that plankton and crabs made together, and at some point it was removed. The crossed out chum is crabs acknowledging quietly that plankton's contribution was real and then deciding to subtract it. That's a very specific kind of cruelty. Sandy Cheeks is from Texas. She is a squirrel. She lives at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean in a glass dome filled with air and a large tree. Outside the dome, she wears a pressurized suit and a clear, spherical helmet. She has a southern accent, uses lasso-based combat, is the most scientifically competent character in Bikini Bottom by a considerable margin, and her presence at the bottom of the sea has never been fully explained. The short official answer is that she's a scientist who came to study sea creatures. Early episodes establish this clearly enough. She's conducting research, she's curious about underwater life. She's there professionally. Needs review, later episodes bring in more detail. She works for a group of British scientist chimpanzees named Dr. Marmalade, Lord Reginald, and Professor Percy, who fund her research from the surface. The 2024 Netflix film Saving Bikini Bottom the Sandy Cheeks movie, adds a new layer. Sandy was apparently sent to Bikini Bottom by a Texas science bureau whose director turns out to have been exploiting her research without her knowledge. Whether that film is fully canonical is a question the show's expanded universe leaves rather vague. Hillenburg reportedly said Sandy is from Houston. The Marine Institute connection, that a squirrel from the surface would be sent underwater to study marine biology, is the kind of detail that makes complete sense if you think about it from a certain angle. Scientists do go places most people don't, to study things most people don't think about. Sandy is essentially a research scientist on a field posting. What I find more interesting than her origin is her choice to stay. Sandy does not have a home in Texas. She has family there, she mentions parents, and there's a twin brother named Randy. She has colleagues on the surface. She goes back occasionally for visits, but she has made her permanent life in a glass dome at the bottom of the ocean, in a town populated by creatures she's ostensibly there to study. That's an odd professional choice that has become a personal one. Sandy is never shown being lonely in Bikini Bottom the way Squidward is. She seems genuinely content there, which is something the show doesn't fully interrogate. You might expect there to be more friction. A land creature in an underwater world, always in a suit, always in a helmet when she's outside, breathing different air, sleeping in a different environment. But Sandy doesn't present as someone who's sacrificing anything for her work. She seems to like it there. She built her own technology, built her own home, joined her own community. The dome is full of trees and air and a bird bath and a picnic table. She made it work. She's the most competent character in the show, quietly. Sandy builds things that function. She has invented time travel, teleportation, various weapons, a submarine, and numerous other devices that she uses, and then apparently just leaves in her dome. The show never makes a big deal of this. She's just Sandy, who happens to also be a polymath engineer. In a world where the rest of the cast is defined by their incompetence in various ways, Sandy is defined by being quietly excellent at nearly everything she tries. Sandy's hibernation is one of the show's more interesting departures into actual biology. Real squirrels in certain climates do hibernate, or enter a similar state called torpor. Their metabolism slows dramatically, their body temperature drops, and they become effectively unconscious for extended periods. Sandy hibernates in the show, and the episodes that deal with this are among the stranger ones in the series. In Survival of the Idiots, SpongeBob and Patrick enter Sandy's tree dome during winter to find Sandy hibernating, but Sandy, in hibernation, is not small and cute and quietly sleeping. She's enormous. She's transformed into something vast and muscular and unpredictable, a massive furred creature that doesn't recognize SpongeBob and Patrick as people she knows and treats them as prey. They spend the episode trying to survive inside the dome, while a version of Sandy that is operating on pure instinct tries to deal with them. The episode is a horror episode dressed up as a comedy, and it works because the threat is completely real within the show's logic. This is biologically interesting too. Hibernation in real squirrels does involve significant physical changes. Muscle retention during torpor is actually quite remarkable, and squirrels who hibernate come back out in spring in better condition than you might expect. The idea that Sandy's hibernation makes her something genuinely other, something that the Sandy who drinks tea and builds submarines is not, plays with real science in a way that Hillenburg would have appreciated. Sandy's tree dome, as an engineering achievement, also deserves more credit than it usually gets. She lives in a pressurized, air-filled glass dome at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The dome maintains Earth-standard atmospheric pressure and oxygen levels inside it, despite being surrounded by water. It supports a tree, a large grass area, a bird bath, a picnic table, and a sort of tower lab structure. This is an extraordinary piece of engineering that Sandy apparently completed before the show began, and then didn't need to think about much afterwards. The dome just works steadily for 25 years of episodes, never failing, never requiring maintenance on screen. The tree dome is, in a sense, Sandy's most impressive invention. She made a piece of Texas and put it at the bottom of the ocean. She brought her home with her because leaving entirely was presumably something she wasn't willing to do. The tree inside the dome has been there since Tea at the Tree Dome, Sandy's first episode. She's been tending it for 25 years. That's not a research station anymore. That's just where she lives. The nuclear theory connection for Sandy is the one I find hardest to evaluate, honestly. The idea that land animals were brought into the nuclear test zone as experimental subjects, and that this explains Sandy's presence, is evocative, and it fits the broader theory. But it also requires several generations of adaptation and mutation, and Sandy doesn't behave like a mutant. She behaves like a completely normal squirrel from Texas who built some technology and went to the ocean. If the nuclear theory explains SpongeBob and Patrick and Squidward, it suggests they're the product of transformation. Sandy seems like she came from somewhere that hadn't been transformed. There's a fan theory that's been circulating about SpongeBob for well over a decade, and it goes like this. The 7 main characters each represent one of the 7 deadly sins from Christian theology. SpongeBob is lust, Patrick is sloth, Squidward is wrath, Sandy is pride, Mr. Krabs is greed, Plankton is envy, and Gary is gluttony. This theory has been shared millions of times on social media and is probably the single most discussed SpongeBob fan theory, so it's worth actually looking at. Some of the mappings are really clean. Mr. Krabs and greed is perhaps the most obvious character to sin connection in any children's cartoon. The show barely needs to establish it. It's just what he is. Plankton and envy is similarly clear. His entire existence is organised around wanting what Mr. Krabs has. Everything Plankton does is downstream of looking at the Krusty Krab and feeling that loss. Patrick and sloth works well. Patrick doesn't work, doesn't aspire, sleeps under a rock, and is largely indifferent to whether anything happens around him. Sandy and pride makes sense too. Her pride in being Texan and in being the smartest creature in the room gets her into trouble, more than once. Squidward and wrath is reasonable as a dominant trait, though Squidward is also vain, and his anger is usually a response to something rather than a general state of being. He's not wrath the way Krabs is greed, it's not his whole personality, just the one that comes up most when SpongeBob and Patrick are involved. Gary and gluttony is funny and loosely true. Gary does eat constantly and with some dedication. SpongeBob as lust is the one that tends to confuse people, and for good reason. Tom Kenny, when asked about it, said SpongeBob's lust would just be for more hours at work. The original definition of lust in theological terms is explicitly sexual. It refers to excessive venereal desire, a yearning that overrides reason. In that broader sense, SpongeBob's intense, overwhelming need to be liked, to be at work, to be cooking, to maintain his specific relationships, does have a quality of excessive longing. In December 2024, the Esquire cast reunion video addressed this theory directly. Roger Bumpass noted that some of the connections seemed right to him. Mr. Lawrence, who writes for the show, said something more measured. Characters have distinct traits, but it probably wasn't as concrete as deliberately mapping to the 7 sins. He didn't think the writers sat down and assigned sins to characters. That's almost certainly true. The theory persists not because Hillenburg was secretly writing biblical allegory, but because a group of 7 distinct characters with strong defining traits can always be mapped onto a set of 7 broad archetypes. The 7 sins are essentially just a list of human personality extremes. If you have 7 vivid characters and 7 categories, you'll find connections. It doesn't require intent on the writer's part. What's more interesting to me than whether the theory is true is what it reveals about how the characters are designed. Each of the main SpongeBob characters does have a dominant defining quality that runs through everything they do. They're designed as archetypes more than as full-round characters in the way that, say, a prestige drama would write them. That's not a criticism. It's appropriate for what the show is. But it's interesting that the characters are legible enough in their dominant trait that you can line them up against a medieval theological framework and have it mostly work. Hillenburg came from a scientific background where you classify organisms by their most distinctive features. A field guide to marine life describes each creature by what makes it recognizable. Maybe that taxonomic instinct carried over into character design. Each character defined by their clearest, most identifiable quality, the way a species is defined by its most observable trait. The alternative theory that's been circulating alongside the 7 deadly sins, one is that the main characters each represent a specific mental health condition or cognitive difference. SpongeBob is ADHD or autism, Patrick represents an intellectual disability, Squidward has narcissistic personality disorder, Sandy has OCD expressed through her compulsive scientific cataloguing, Mr. Krabs shows obsessive-compulsive tendencies around money, Plankton has paranoid personality disorder, and so on. This theory went through a significant wave of discussion in 2023 following a TikTok video that laid it out, and it became quite widely shared. Tom Kenny's comments in 2024 about thinking of SpongeBob as autistic fit into this framework without quite confirming it. The mental health reading is interesting because it's slightly less deterministic than the sins reading. Sins in the theological sense are moral failures. They imply culpability, the idea that the person could choose otherwise. Mental health conditions are, at least partly, things that happen to people rather than choices they make. Reading Plankton as envious implies a moral judgment about him. Reading Plankton as paranoid personality disorder is more sympathetic. He's not evil, he's suffering. What's notable is that the show's cast, when asked about these theories, generally respond with interest rather than dismissal. They don't say the theories are wrong so much as they clarify that the characters weren't consciously designed around these frameworks. The difference between this theory is wrong and we didn't plan this, but I can see why people see it is significant. The second response is the one the cast tends to give, and it implies that the frameworks reveal something true about the characters even if they weren't the blueprint for them. The reason these theories propagate isn't because people are looking for secret meanings where there aren't any. It's because the characters are vivid and consistent enough that patterns become visible in them. Good character writing produces this as a side effect. When a character is coherent enough that their behaviour is predictable across many different situations, you can reverse engineer the logic of who they are. The theories are just that reverse engineering made explicit. Pearl Krabs is a sperm whale. Mr. Krabs is a crab. She is his daughter. This has never been explained, and as of now, the show has committed to never explaining it. What the show establishes, Pearl is Mr. Krabs' daughter. Her mother was, presumably, also a whale, and was Mrs. Krabs. Mrs. Krabs is referenced occasionally, but never shown or named. Pearl will inherit the Krusty Krab. She is a teenager who is embarrassed by her father, loves boy bands and pop music, and wants a life bigger than Bikini Bottom. She is enormous, and her father is tiny, and they go through the same conflicts any parent and teenage child go through, scaled to the particular absurdity of their situation. Hillenburg's position on Pearl was consistent. He didn't want her backstory explored. After his death, the show's production team, including animator Vincent Waller, said they're honouring that wish. Pearl's mother, how Mr. Krabs came to have a whale daughter, and what the genetics of any of this could possibly mean, these remain off the table. The fan theories have filled the void as they do. The most discussed involves whale falls. A whale fall is a real phenomenon. When a whale dies in the ocean and its body sinks to the floor, it becomes a complex ecosystem that supports hundreds of species for decades. The whale's body is food, then habitat, then an extended source of nutrition, as chemical processes break it down. Some fan theorists have connected this to the Krusty Krab's success, the theory being that Mr. Krabs built his restaurant on or around the whale fall of Pearl's mother, which would explain a reliable food source, and that he adopted Pearl from the wreckage of her family's death. This theory was specifically denied by Vincent Waller, so we can set it aside, though the biological detail about whale falls is genuinely interesting regardless. Pearl's character is one of the show's quieter mysteries in a different sense. She's one of the few residents of Bikini Bottom who is actively dissatisfied with being there. SpongeBob loves it. Patrick barely registers that it exists. Sandy made it work. Squidward wants out in theory, but stays in practice. Pearl actively wants something different. A bigger life, more excitement, something beyond the town where she grew up. The show plays this as teenage restlessness, which it probably is. But given that Pearl is the child of Bikini Bottom's wealthiest resident, and given that she has resources and connections that most residents don't, the question of why she stays is slightly different for her than it is for the others. She stays because she's a teenager, and teenagers stay. But Pearl's story, the version of it that exists in the gaps between episodes, is one of those threads the show picked up and quietly set down without following wherever it might have gone. The question of how a crab fathers a whale is one that the show has never even bothered to lampshade. There's no episode where characters express puzzlement about the biological relationship. Everyone just accepts that Pearl is Krabs' daughter and moves on. In a world where a squirrel lives underwater and a snail is a social pet, this is perhaps not the most pressing question. Pearl's mother's absence is the more interesting mystery. The show hints at Mrs. Krabs occasionally. She's referenced but never shown, never named, and described only as a whale, which is obviously Pearl's source. But a whale who fell in love with a crab, had a child with him, and is now gone. Where? When? Why? Is a story the show keeps implying and refusing to tell. The whale fall theory, as disturbing as it is, has a structural elegance that I find hard to entirely dismiss, despite its being explicitly denied by the production team. Whale falls in real ecology are remarkable things. When a large whale dies and sinks, its body becomes what marine biologists call a food oasis. It supports hundreds of species over decades, moving through distinct phases as different organisms exploit different resources. There are whalefall communities that have been found with species not seen anywhere else, creatures that evolved specifically to take advantage of this particular kind of sustained resource. The idea that the Krusty Krab was built on or around something like this would explain a great deal about why the restaurant works and others don't. Vincent Waller denied it. I'm noting it because the denial was specific enough to confirm that the question had reached the production team. Pearl as a character is doing something that most of the other main characters aren't. She's in the process of becoming something. SpongeBob is finished becoming what he is. Squidward is stuck in the process. Plankton has committed to a direction. But Pearl is a teenager, which means she's in transition, which means the show could in theory tell a story about where she ends up. That story hasn't been told. Whether it ever will be, or whether Pearl is simply always going to be the teenager who's embarrassed by her dad, is one of the show's quieter open questions. If you look at the sky in Bikini Bottom, and you can see it quite clearly in a lot of establishing shots, there are objects floating above the buildings that look like stylized flowers. They're bright colours, they drift slowly, they give off a warm light. The instinctive interpretation is that they're clouds, an artistic choice to make the underwater world feel more like a cheerful surface environment. Hillenburg was a marine biologist. He was also very deliberate about the visual world he created, so it's worth asking whether those clouds are actually supposed to be clouds or something else entirely. One popular theory, they're boat propellers. Bikini Bottom is beneath a busy section of the Pacific Ocean. Ships pass overhead constantly. This is established in the show, where the surface world is accessed regularly, and boats are everywhere. From directly below, a slowly rotating boat propeller seen through water could look like a flower shape. The petals are the blades. The ones further away are softer and lighter. The ones overhead are brighter and larger. If that's true, every establishing shot of Bikini Bottom's sky is actually a view of the underside of the world above. Boats sailing overhead, propellers turning, casting flower-shaped shadows into the water below. The characters look up at what they experience as a cheerful sky, and they're actually looking at the undersides of ships. Another reading, coral formations. Bikini Atoll is a coral reef, and coral grows in branching, flower-like shapes. The clouds could be stylized renderings of coral structures. Hillenburg's visual world was consciously influenced by the actual ecology of Pacific reefs, so this wouldn't be out of place. The third possibility is the one that most production retrospectives settle on. The flower shapes are part of the Polynesian Hawaiian aesthetic that runs through the whole show's design. Hawaiian fabric patterns are full of flower motifs: hibiscus flowers, plumeria, bird of paradise blooms. The visual language Hillenburg was drawing from uses flowers as a standard decorative element, so the clouds being flower-shaped is consistent with the general design philosophy. All three explanations could be true simultaneously, which is often how visual design works. You make a choice for one reason, and it also works for three other reasons. The propeller reading is the most interesting to me, because it quietly implies that the character's world is always overlaid with the surface world they mostly never think about. The boats keep sailing, the propellers keep turning, and down below, in a town built on nuclear history, everyone looks up at what they believe is the sky. The visual language of Bikini Bottom extends beyond the flower clouds to encompass a specific palette: warm yellows, sandy tones, the particular turquoise green of the water that's consistent across the show in a way that creates a strong sense of place. Even when the geography is inconsistent and the distances don't make sense, the colour environment is stable. Bikini Bottom always looks like Bikini Bottom. This is a design choice that pays off in subtle ways. The show's colour world was influenced by Hawaiian and Polynesian aesthetics, as I mentioned, but it also draws on the actual visual quality of shallow Pacific coral reef environments. Real coral reefs, the healthy ones, the ones that haven't been bleached, are intensely colourful. They're not the cartoon rendering, but the cartoon rendering isn't entirely wrong about the general quality of the light and colour there. What's interesting is that Bikini Atoll's actual reefs, after the nuclear tests, have become unusually vibrant in certain areas. The 2017 study that found abundant marine life in the nuclear craters described coral growing in intense colours over the blasted terrain. The destruction had, paradoxically, created the conditions for an explosion of colour and life in the areas that weren't continuously contaminated. There's something almost SpongeBobish about that, in the sense that the show's cheerfully coloured world is sitting on top of a history of destruction, and the cheerfulness might be an accurate rendering of what happens when life reasserts itself in a blasted place. The surface exists in SpongeBob's world. This is easy to forget because most of the show takes place entirely underwater, but the surface is present throughout. Characters go there, characters come from there, and the relationship between the underwater world and the above-water world is one of the show's most consistently interesting and underexplored tensions. Sandy came from the surface. She's the most obvious example of surface-world contact, a creature from Texas who made her life in Bikini Bottom. She's been back to visit, has family there, has colleagues there. The surface is, for Sandy, just another place. Mrs. Puff runs a boating school. The boats in Bikini Bottom are exactly what you'd recognise as cars, but they're driven like boats through water. They have steering wheels and bonnets and headlights, and they park in car parks. The entire automotive infrastructure of the surface world has been reproduced underwater, with marine naming conventions. Nobody in Bikini Bottom seems to find this odd. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are human-adjacent superheroes who live in a retirement home in Bikini Bottom. They breathe underwater thanks to a magic sea star on Mermaid Man's face and barnacles in Barnacle Boy's lungs. Their backstory, what they actually were before retiring, who they fought, how they came to settle in Bikini Bottom, is presented as comic book lore within the show rather than something we can verify. Ernest Borgnine voiced Mermaid Man until his death in 2012, and Tim Conway voiced Barnacle Boy until his death in 2019. The characters' presence in the show has become more delicate since then, though they do still appear occasionally. The first SpongeBob movie takes SpongeBob and Patrick to Shell City on the surface, which turns out to be a gift shop run by a human. Humans exist in this world. They're rare in Bikini Bottom, but they're real. The show's universe is one where humans and sea creatures coexist in parallel layers of the same ocean, one on top, one below. What's interesting about the surface world in the show is that it's not treated as better or worse than the underwater world. Sandy misses Texas sometimes, but she doesn't spend every episode longing for the surface. The surface is just elsewhere. Bikini Bottom is complete in itself, with its own economy and culture and social hierarchy, and the existence of a whole other world above it sits in the background without troubling anyone very much. The Camp Corral spin-off that was made after Hillenburg's death, which he had known about and reportedly approved before his death, attempts to show young versions of the characters before the show's events. It creates continuity problems. Young SpongeBob in Camp Coral contradicts things established about SpongeBob's childhood in the original series. This is the kind of thing that matters less if you're watching casually, and more if you've spent 20 years paying close attention to a cartoon, which some people absolutely have. The boats as cars thing deserves a bit more attention because it's one of those background details that, when you notice it, you can't stop noticing. Bikini Bottom has cars. They call them boats. They park in car parks, drive on roads, have bonnets and boots, get flat tyres, need maintenance. Mrs. Puff's boating school teaches people to drive boats, using a curriculum and test that is recognisably a driving test. SpongeBob's inability to pass is specifically an inability to control the vehicle without causing mayhem. He's not bad at knowing the rules. He's bad at the physical act of driving. The in-universe explanation, if you're looking for one, is that the surface world has cars and the underwater world adopted car culture, but renamed everything to fit the aquatic setting. This implies significant cultural exchange between the surface and the underwater world at some point in Bikini Bottom's past, a borrowing of surface technologies and practices that the underwater community adapted for their environment. The boats as cars detail is evidence of a longer history of contact between the two worlds than the show usually acknowledges. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are the most direct evidence of long-term surface-underwater exchange. Two beings who appear human have made their retirement home on the ocean floor and are accepted as members of the community without any particular comment on how unusual this is. If you take the nuclear origin seriously, it's possible that the radiation events that created Bikini Bottom's sentient sea creatures also had effects that moved in both directions, making sea creatures more human-adjacent while making some human-adjacent creatures more able to inhabit the underwater world. Mermaid Man might literally be the result of the same events that created SpongeBob, just on the human end of the transformation spectrum. This is speculative, obviously. The show doesn't go there, but it's interesting to think about. In the 2004 SpongeBob movie, SpongeBob mentions that he's been Employee of the Month at the Krusty Krab for 374 consecutive months. 374 months is just over 31 years. If you take that at face value and work backwards from 2004, SpongeBob would have started working at the Krusty Krab around 1973. This has led some fans to argue that the show is set, in some loose sense, in the 1970s or early 1980s. The technology in early episodes is suggestive: film cameras, VHS-style media formats, rotary phones, things that feel retro without being placed in a specific era. The aesthetic has a particular quality that could be read as deliberately vintage. But then later episodes feature what are clearly smartphones, references to internet culture, streaming video, and contemporary media trends. The timeline evaporates if you push on it. The show doesn't take place in any fixed decade. It takes place in whatever decade each individual episode needs it to take place in. This is completely standard for long-running animated series. The Simpsons has the same issue at much greater scale. Homer and Marge's backstory has been rewritten to fit several different decades as the show has continued, and their children never age. SpongeBob operates the same way. The show's present is always the viewer's present. The characters never age, and continuity is maintained only when it's convenient. What makes SpongeBob's floating timeline slightly stranger than The Simpsons is that SpongeBob has spin-offs that attempt to establish a fixed chronology. Camp Coral shows the characters as children at a summer camp. The spin-off, The Patrick Star Show, implies an earlier setting. These additions create a clearer timeline, but they do it inconsistently with the original series, which already had a loosely defined one. Hillenburg's position on this was reportedly relaxed. He was making individual cartoons, not a serialized drama. Each episode was meant to work on its own terms. The 374 months detail in the movie was probably just a big number that sounded funny, not intended as biographical data that fans would use to calculate what year SpongeBob was born. The show has visited the question of aging occasionally. In one episode, SpongeBob and Patrick briefly appear as old men. In another, characters flash forward to old age. These are always temporary, always resolved, and never integrated into any ongoing continuity. The characters are effectively frozen. SpongeBob will always be employed at the Krusty Krab. Patrick will always be under his rock. Squidward will always be practicing the clarinet and failing to be appreciated for it. The loop doesn't break. There's something comfortable about that, actually. The floating timeline means you can watch any SpongeBob episode from any season and it will make sense in isolation. The world is always in the same state. The status quo always returns. For a sleep video, this is a rather apt thing to be talking about. A show where everything resets and nothing is ever permanently lost. The 1970s reading of SpongeBob does have some support beyond just the mathematics. The show's early seasons have a retro quality, not deliberately vintage, but reminiscent of a certain kind of American optimism that feels more like the 1970s than the early 2000s. SpongeBob's enthusiasm, his love of his job, his lack of irony, these qualities feel slightly period, slightly like a character from an era before the kind of cynicism that became culturally dominant in the 1980s and 90s. But then the show runs to the present, and SpongeBob's world accommodates contemporary references. A character from 1972 who is still living in his original world, but somehow also aware of streaming services and smartphone culture, is a genuinely paradoxical entity. The floating timeline has produced a character who is temporally incoherent, who exists simultaneously in multiple eras without committing to any of them. This is not a complaint about the show. The floating timeline serves the show's purposes, but it does mean that SpongeBob, unlike most fictional characters, has no fixed placement in history. He's not a product of a specific cultural moment. He's a product of every cultural moment simultaneously, which is either a strength or an incoherence, depending on how you feel about it. The Camp Coral spin-off's attempt to fix a childhood for the characters raises its own paradoxes. If SpongeBob attended a summer camp as a child with Patrick and Sandy, and if that childhood occurred in a specific decade, then the show has a timeline. But Camp Coral doesn't commit to a decade. It uses contemporary references while depicting what's nominally a flashback. This produces children living in a past that looks exactly like the present, which is either an artistic choice or a reflection of the difficulty of actually committing to a timeline for characters who have never had one. Gary is SpongeBob's pet snail. In Bikini Bottom, snails are the rough equivalent of cats. They meow, they behave like cats, they're kept as domestic pets. Gary meows. SpongeBob usually understands him. Other characters occasionally seem to understand him too, depending on the episode, though the show is not consistent about this. The standard reading of Gary is that he's SpongeBob's cat analogue, loyal, somewhat imperious, clearly intelligent in an animal way, but essentially a pet. The show generally supports this. Gary has a food bowl, he needs to be looked after, he sleeps in a pet-appropriate location. But there are episodes that suggest Gary is operating at a considerably higher level than he lets on. In several episodes, Gary solves problems that the adult characters around him cannot. He has saved SpongeBob's life on multiple occasions through what appears to be deliberate, planned intervention. In one episode, it's revealed that Gary has been secretly reading SpongeBob's books, and has apparently read through much of SpongeBob's library. He's not just a pet who stays in one spot. He uses his time when SpongeBob is out, and what he does with it is left somewhat open. The 7 deadly sins theory assigns Gary gluttony, which is the one that makes most intuitive sense. He eats frequently and with commitment. But gluttony, as the defining characteristic of a creature who reads books and solves puzzles, seems like an underestimate. There's also the matter of Patrick. In one episode, it's revealed that Gary used to belong to Patrick before he came to live with SpongeBob. Patrick gave him up, or lost him. The exact circumstances are left vague. When this comes to light, SpongeBob and Patrick have one of the show's more genuinely tense conflicts, with both of them claiming Gary. Gary eventually chooses SpongeBob. The episode is called Dumped, and it's one of the more emotionally grounded things the show ever did. It's played like a custody dispute, and Gary's choice matters. The detail I find most telling is that Gary is categorized alongside the show's biggest sins as gluttony, the most animal of the 7. In a theory that maps the characters onto moral archetypes, Gary is placed at the bottom of the human hierarchy. But in practice, Gary is often the character who is quietly managing things in the background. He's not loud about his intelligence. He doesn't announce it. He just sort of gets on with it. This is, frankly, the most cat-like thing about him. The Dumped episode is worth describing in some detail because it's one of the more carefully constructed emotional sequences in SpongeBob's history. The setup is simple. Gary starts spending time with Patrick. SpongeBob, who has always taken Gary's presence for granted in the way pet owners often do, suddenly faces the possibility of losing him and becomes acutely aware of how much Gary means to him. The episode's emotional logic is careful. SpongeBob doesn't become angry at Gary or Patrick in a straightforward way. He becomes confused, then anxious, then quietly devastated. He tries to understand what he did wrong, what Patrick has that he doesn't, why Gary would choose differently. The answer, when it comes, is both funny and a little sad. Gary was following a cookie that Patrick had in his pocket. Gary didn't leave SpongeBob for Patrick. Gary followed a cookie. But in the process, SpongeBob learned something about the relationship he'd been taking for granted, and the episode lets him sit with that. The fact that Gary briefly chooses to live with Patrick instead of SpongeBob is established in this episode, and is significant for the character's backstory in a way that's not always appreciated. Patrick had a pet snail and gave him up, either lost him, neglected him, or simply didn't notice he'd gone. Gary ended up with SpongeBob, who did notice. The episode is, in part, about the difference between those two kinds of attention. The snail as cat convention in Bikini Bottom is one of those consistent world-building details that Hillenburg got right immediately. The meowing is perfect. It both signals this is the cat and is also biologically strange in exactly the right way, because why would a snail meow? The answer within the show's logic is that Bikini Bottom's equivalent of the cat is the snail. The answer outside the show's logic is that Gary meows because it's funnier than whatever else he might do, and because it makes the audience understand his function immediately. Mrs. Puff runs boating school. This means she teaches the residents of Bikini Bottom how to drive boats, and her most notable student is SpongeBob, who has been trying to pass his driving test since the first season and has not succeeded. In the time the show has been airing, if we take the floating timeline at face value, SpongeBob has been in Mrs. Puff's class for somewhere between 25 and 30 years, depending on how you count it. Mrs. Puff has been arrested, imprisoned, hospitalized, and institutionalized more times than virtually any other character in the show, and it is almost always a direct consequence of SpongeBob's driving disasters. The show treats this as a running gag. SpongeBob causes some catastrophic vehicle incident. Mrs. Puff is caught in the blast radius, or held responsible as his instructor, and she ends up in jail again. The cycle repeats. Her first name is never given. She's always Mrs. Puff. The Mrs. implies a previous marriage, and there is, in one episode, a reference to Mr. Puff, who is implied to have been turned into a lamp, a taxidermied pufferfish lamp to be specific. The show does not elaborate. Mr. Puff becoming a lamp, and Mrs. Puff then becoming a boating school teacher who routinely ends up in prison, is the kind of background detail SpongeBob drops and then never picks up again. There's a layer to Mrs. Puff's history that suggests she came to Bikini Bottom to start fresh after some previous life she'd rather not discuss. In one episode, it's strongly implied she changed her name and moved there deliberately, and that there's a version of her past she's concealing. The show gestures at this and then retreats from it, leaving Mrs. Puff's origins as intriguingly unresolved as pearls. What the show is clear about: she is genuinely trying to help SpongeBob. She's not cruel to him. She doesn't mock him. She gives him every opportunity. She teaches as well as she can, and she keeps being blamed for his failures in ways that have made her life genuinely worse. Her suffering is almost entirely caused by someone who means her no harm and sincerely wants to pass his test. There's something to be said about the structure of that relationship. SpongeBob's inability to drive is one of the show's foundational premises. If he could drive, a large portion of his arc would resolve. So the show needs him to keep failing, which means the show needs Mrs. Puff to keep suffering the consequences. She is trapped in her situation by the narrative requirements of the show itself, in a way that's more visible than the other characters' comparable situations. The pufferfish biology matters here too. Mrs. Puff is a pufferfish, which means she inflates when frightened. Every time SpongeBob causes a driving disaster, she inflates. The show uses this as a visual indicator of her distress. She literally swells with the anxiety of what's happening. It's a clever piece of character design. Her emotional state is always externally visible, always obvious, always a little bit out of her control. She's transparent in a way the other characters aren't forced to be. Mrs. Puff's specific incarcerations are worth cataloguing briefly, not because it's a particularly neat list, but because the variety of reasons she ends up in jail says something about how the show views her situation. She's been imprisoned because SpongeBob's driving caused property damage. She's been imprisoned because she was at the scene of an incident caused by SpongeBob's driving. She's been imprisoned for events set in motion by SpongeBob's driving that she was only tangentially involved with. The through line is always SpongeBob. Not Mrs. Puff making bad choices, but Mrs. Puff being in the blast radius of someone else's choices. In one episode, Mrs. Puff devises an elaborate plan to get SpongeBob to fail his driving test by having him drive with his eyes closed, which backfires when SpongeBob passes the test with his eyes closed. The episode plays this as absurdist comedy, but the logic underneath it is Mrs. Puff trying to protect herself and the community from SpongeBob's driving by doing something mildly dishonest. She's not vindictive, she's desperate. There's a version of Mrs. Puff's story where she's the central character, and SpongeBob is the antagonist, not a malicious one, but one whose presence consistently makes her life worse. In that version, Mrs. Puff is a professional doing her job with reasonable competence, who happens to have a student who is unteachable for reasons that are not her fault and not his, and who suffers the consequences of this repeatedly without recourse. She can't expel him, she can't have him removed, she can't take her job somewhere else because the job is there, and so is he. She is stuck like Squidward, but her stuckness is imposed more directly from outside. Her mysterious past, the implied name change, the suggestion that she came to Bikini Bottom to start over, is one of those background mysteries that the show planted early and never developed. It invites speculation. What was her life before Bikini Bottom? What made her want to leave it? Why teaching? Why boating? Why here? These questions don't have answers. They're just the shape of a backstory that never got written. Chum, in the real world, is the stuff you throw into water to attract fish. It's made of fish parts, blood, bones, offal, ground up scraps. Fishing boats use it to draw fish toward the surface. It smells extremely bad. It is not something you would serve in a restaurant. Plankton serves chum at the chum bucket. This is one of those details that the show plays as straightforward comedy. Plankton's food is disgusting and no one eats there, but which becomes progressively stranger the more you think about it. Bikini Bottom is populated by fish and sea creatures. Chum is made from fish and sea creatures. Plankton is serving the residents of Bikini Bottom a product made from the ground-up remains of creatures identical to themselves. Tom Kenny, when asked whether the Krabby Patty might contain fish, said he was pretty sure it doesn't, because that would be cannibalism. This is a funny observation in the context of the Krabby Patty. It applies to the chum bucket rather more directly, but no one seems to mention that. The show acknowledges the chum's awfulness, but doesn't interrogate what it's made of. Plankton's food is terrible. That's the joke. Digging into exactly why the food is terrible, what the ingredients are, what that means in the context of a world populated by the kinds of creatures those ingredients come from. That's not where the show goes. There's a genuinely interesting thing underneath all of this, though, which is that Plankton doesn't seem to understand why he fails. He works constantly. He invents constantly. He schemes and plans and executes with more effort than virtually any other character in the show. He just has a fundamental misreading of what people want, and he keeps doubling down on his specific vision of his product rather than changing it. Plankton as a character name has a specific meaning in real marine biology that's worth noting. Plankton, in oceanography, refers to organisms that drift in the water column, the vast community of microscopic creatures that forms the base of the ocean's food chain. Real plankton includes phytoplankton, plant-like organisms that photosynthesize, and zooplankton, animal-like organisms. They are collectively among the most important life forms on Earth. They produce roughly half of the world's oxygen and form the foundation of almost every marine food web, which makes Sheldon J. Plankton's total commercial failure the most ecologically ironic joke in the show. The single most important organism in the real ocean, unable to get one customer through the door. Sheldon J. Plankton, the character, is a single-celled organism of some kind. The show is vague about his biology, but he's depicted as very small, green, and unicellular in the way that various microorganisms are. He has one eye, which is a detail that real single-celled organisms obviously don't have. His smallness relative to the other characters is a constant visual joke. He is, quite literally, a tiny creature trying to compete in a world of much larger ones. The ecological irony is significant. Real plankton supports everything in the ocean. Sheldon Plankton supports nothing. His restaurant fails, his plans fail, his existence in the show is defined by failure. The most important thing in the real ocean has become, in the cartoon, the least successful character in Bikini Bottom. This might be deliberate. Hillenburg knew what plankton was and what it did, naming the villain after it could be a joke about the gap between ecological significance and social status. A creature that matters enormously in the real world, rendered as a sad, scheming failure in the fictional one. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are SpongeBob's favourite superheroes. They were once the greatest defenders of the seas. Now they're retired and live in a home called Shady Shoals Rest Home in Bikini Bottom. And SpongeBob is an enthusiastic fan who gets to interact with them regularly, which is one of those details about SpongeBob's life that's actually rather sweet if you think about it. Your childhood heroes are your neighbours. The characters were voiced by Ernest Borgnine and Tim Conway, both classic Hollywood character actors who had made their names decades before SpongeBob. Borgnine died in 2012. Conway died in 2019. The show has been careful about using the characters since, which is appropriate. Their voices were specific and irreplaceable, and the comedy came substantially from Borgnine and Conway's genuine chemistry, friends in real life who found these absurd roles late in their careers and seemed to enjoy them enormously. The unresolved questions about Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are numerous. They appear to be humanoid creatures, bipedal, human proportioned, not obviously fish or crustacean, living underwater without any special breathing apparatus. The show never addresses how this works. They just live there. Their actual backstory as a superhero duo is presented through SpongeBob's fandom rather than through any reliable account. There are old television episodes of a Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy show. Within the show, VHS tapes SpongeBob owns, merchandise, a fan club. The show treats their history as something both SpongeBob and the viewer know about from media, not something we see directly. This is a neat structural choice. It keeps the backstory impressionistic, something felt rather than established. The evil organisation they fought, called EVIL, an acronym the show defines and then mostly forgets, has members who occasionally appear in Bikini Bottom as supervillains. The implication that old supervillains have simply integrated into suburban life and are going about their days is quietly funny. Barnacle Boy's arc, across his appearances, is about being taken seriously. He was the sidekick as a young man. He's still being called boy and treated as the junior partner now that he's an old man. At one point he actually defects to the villain side in protest, which Mermaid Man takes badly. It's an argument between two very old men that is played partly as farce and partly as something genuinely human. The frustration of never having your contribution recognised, even after decades. There's something in the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes about the relationship between heroism and age. The show is affectionate about them. They're never mocked cruelly, never made into figures of contempt. They're old and tired and a bit confused sometimes, and they're also genuinely the people they were, just with less energy for it. The heroism hasn't gone away, it's just that the world has moved on around them a bit. The specific episodes featuring Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy that hold up best are the ones that lean into Borgnine and Conway's genuine friendship, rather than just using them as props for SpongeBob's hero worship. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 3, where Barnacle Boy finally gets a fish dinner without having to eat a kid's meal, is quietly sweet in ways the broader superhero plot isn't. Barnacle Boy just wants to be treated as an adult. He doesn't want to fight crime in the same old way. He wants his contribution acknowledged. These are old man problems dressed in superhero clothing, and Borgnine and Conway played them with the warmth of two people who had actually lived long enough to understand them. The karate organisation, which Mermaid Man tends to say while raising his fists, because the word itself seems to galvanise him, was eventually retroactively explained as an acronym for various evil things the organisation has done, though the show has never been fully consistent about what it stands for. What remains consistent is that Mermaid Man's mention of karate snaps him out of confusion and into action in a Pavlovian way. Decades after the fight is over, the word still works on him, some conditioning runs deep. The question of where Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy came from physically is one the show deliberately never answers. There at Shady Shoals, they have been there for a long time. The community treats them as familiar presences. SpongeBob has been watching their television show on VHS tapes for what seems like his entire life. The heroes predate the current version of Bikini Bottom as the characters know it. They're part of the town's history in a way that most other characters aren't. After Borgnine's death in 2012, the show stopped giving Mermaid Man new dialogue, and the character has only appeared in non-speaking cameos since then. Since then, the characters have appeared only in archival footage within the show, or in small roles voiced by other actors. It's a sensitive situation, and the show has handled it relatively carefully. The characters are beloved, and losing both the original voices within a few years of each other made any further appearances complicated. The Flying Dutchman is a ghost who haunts Bikini Bottom. He's a massive spectral sailor, green and translucent, who drifts around the ocean in a ghostly ship. He's menacing in the way cartoon ghosts are menacing, loud, dramatic, easily startled by things he didn't expect. He first appears early in the show's run and becomes a recurring character, showing up whenever the plot needs supernatural intervention. He is a ghost. Bikini Bottom is at the bottom of the ocean. There's something quietly absurd about the ghost of a sailor haunting the ocean floor. Sailors traditionally fear the sea. The Flying Dutchman, the real legend, not the SpongeBob version, is a ghost ship doomed to sail the oceans forever, a portent of doom for those who see it. In the mythology, encountering the Flying Dutchman at sea means disaster is coming. The ship and its ghostly crew cannot make port, cannot rest, condemned to sail eternally. In SpongeBob, the Flying Dutchman just sort of lives in the ocean. He has a ship he parks somewhere. He makes demands of the Bikini Bottom residents occasionally. He's a nuisance more than a terror. He occasionally has reasonable motivations for his appearances. In one episode, he's annoyed because SpongeBob and Patrick are using his ship as a haunted house attraction. In another, he tries to collect souls but keeps being thwarted by silliness. The question of whether the Dutchman's ghostly status makes sense in a world where the living residents are underwater is one the show doesn't address. How does a ghost haunt a place that's already at the bottom of the sea? What is the ontology of ghosthood in Bikini Bottom? The usual ghost narrative involves spirits being unable to leave the place where they died, but the Dutchman apparently died at sea, which covers an enormous amount of territory. He seems to have settled on Bikini Bottom specifically. He also has a contract, in one episode, that he uses to collect SpongeBob's soul, which implies that souls exist and can be collected and traded in this world. This raises questions about every other character. Do they have souls? Are those souls collectible? Under what circumstances? And does the Dutchman do this professionally or as a hobby? These questions are not answered because they're not the point. The point is the joke. But the questions are there, sitting under the surface like most things in Bikini Bottom. One detail about the Dutchman that I find genuinely funny. In the show, he can't scare people effectively because his sheet, the traditional ghost sheet, has a hole cut in it where the mouth goes. In real ghost legend, wearing a white sheet is a classic Halloween costume simplification, not an actual property of ghosts. The show's Flying Dutchman has absorbed the Halloween costume version of ghost mythology into his actual form, which is a very specific kind of absurdism. He's a ghost who looks like the costume of a ghost. He's haunted by his own representation. Patrick Starr's family is sketchily established at best, but what's there is interesting. He has a sister named Sam, who appears in a season 7 episode, who is substantially larger and more physically imposing than Patrick, and who seems to regard her brother with a kind of protective loyalty that bypasses reason. Sam Starr makes decisions quickly, physically, and with complete confidence that she is correct. She is a force. Patrick's parents have appeared in the show and are more or less what you'd expect, slightly large, slightly dim, living in their own rock somewhere. The star family are starfish in both the literal and social sense. They're the kind of family that exists in its own orbit, self-contained, not particularly aware of the broader world. Patrick's relationship with his parents is affectionate but undeveloped. They are background, not story. What's more interesting than his family is the question of what Patrick does all day. He has no job, or at least no job that the show has ever shown him holding successfully. He lives under a rock. He has no visible income. He eats, sleeps, watches television occasionally, and spends time with SpongeBob. The show has never explained how Patrick affords anything, including the food he eats in substantial quantities. One reading is that Patrick doesn't need money because he doesn't want anything that costs money. His needs are minimal. He sleeps on sand. He eats what's available. He has SpongeBob nearby, and that's essentially everything he requires. In a capitalist world, which Bikini Bottom certainly is, with the Krusty Krab and the Chum Bucket and various other commercial enterprises visible throughout, Patrick exists mostly outside the economic system because the economic system hasn't needed to reach him yet. There are episodes where Patrick gets jobs, as a fry cook, as an employee at the Krusty Krab, as various other things, and they never last long. Not because he's fired for incompetence, necessarily, but because the jobs resolve whatever situation created them, and Patrick drifts back to his rock. Employment for Patrick is always situational, rather than structural. He's not building anything, not working toward anything, not accumulating anything. He's just there. The sloth reading from the 7 deadly sins theory is accurate in the theological sense. Sloth isn't just laziness, it's a failure to engage with one's life in ways that would benefit oneself and others. Patrick isn't lazy exactly. He's absent from his own life in a way that the other characters aren't. Even Squidward, who resists and complains and fails, is engaged. Patrick is simply not engaged. He's present without being there in any purposeful sense, and yet Patrick's friendship with SpongeBob is genuine and functional and clearly matters to both of them. Within that friendship, Patrick is reliable, present, loyal in his unthinking way. He would do anything for SpongeBob, and has done. The sloth that defines him in relation to the world doesn't apply in relation to SpongeBob. Whatever Patrick is, he's awake for that. SpongeBob SquarePants has, across its run, produced episodes that are surreal in ways that go beyond normal cartoon logic and venture into something that feels more like dream logic or genuine absurdism. These episodes don't follow the usual structure of joke setup and punchline. They follow something harder to describe, a logic that makes internal sense while being entirely disconnected from anything outside itself. Rockabye Bivalve is one of these. SpongeBob and Patrick find a baby scallop and decide to raise it together. They adopt traditional family roles, SpongeBob as the mother who stays home, Patrick as the father who goes to work. Patrick's work is never explained. He leaves in the morning and comes back at night and describes his day in terms of incredible accomplishment, while SpongeBob has been home doing all of the actual labour of caring for the scallop. The episode is a straightforward commentary on the unequal distribution of domestic work, played completely straight within its absurd premise. It ends when Patrick's job is revealed to have been sitting in a chair doing nothing. Nothing at all. For hours. That was his work. Dying for pie is another. Squidward accidentally gives SpongeBob what he believes is an explosive pie, a pie bought from pirates, who apparently put bombs in their baked goods, a thing that Squidward learns about well before SpongeBob has a chance to eat it. Believing SpongeBob has hours to live, Squidward spends a day with him, doing whatever SpongeBob wants, being present in a way he never is. It's a day of genuine friendship between two characters whose relationship is usually defined by one-sided irritation. The episode ends with the pie detonating outside SpongeBob's body, leaving him unharmed. Squidward, relieved that SpongeBob isn't actually dying, is caught in an explosion when SpongeBob's uneaten pie suddenly detonates. The explosion happens outside the character's experience. The friendship is what actually happened. These episodes work because they're doing something that most of the show doesn't bother with. They're using the surreal premise to deliver something true. The bomb is a metaphor. Patrick's work is an observation. The scallop is a family. SpongeBob's forgiveness of Squidward's indifference is the most real thing in a day full of unreality. Hillenburg's marine biology background expressed itself in the writing, but so did his animation school training. CalArts, where he did his MFA, is known for producing animators who think formally, who are interested in what animation as a medium can do that other mediums can't. The show's best episodes have a formal quality that's easy to miss because they're also funny, but the construction is there, deliberate, thought through, doing work that a less carefully made show wouldn't bother with. The surreal episodes are where this formal quality is most visible. They're not just weird for weirdness' sake. The weirdness is precisely calibrated to carry whatever the episode is actually about. And what the episode is actually about is usually something true about friendship, or loneliness, or the gap between what people show and what they feel, or the specific texture of caring about someone who isn't particularly good at caring back. That's what SpongeBob SquarePants is, at its best. A precisely calibrated, surrealist comedy about the difficulty of being alive and the importance of being kind to the people around you, set at the bottom of a nuclear test site in a pineapple that smells nice. Where exactly Bikini Bottom is has been established fairly clearly. It's beneath Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. That's the canonical answer, confirmed by multiple sources, and it sits right in the name. What's less clear is what Bikini Bottom actually looks like as a place, because the show's internal geography is famously inconsistent. Distances change between episodes. Buildings appear and disappear. Locations that are next to each other in one episode are a long journey apart in another. The town has different layouts, depending on what the plot needs. Some of this is simply how long-running animation works. You draw what the scene requires and worry about consistency later, or often not at all. But SpongeBob's geography has always had a particular elasticity to it that goes beyond normal production looseness. There are places called the edge of Bikini Bottom and the end of the world that appear in episodes, suggesting the city has a boundary. Beyond it there's ocean, or nothing clearly defined. Characters have gone to these edges occasionally and found things, other communities, strange landscapes, the occasional inexplicable location. The surface is always above. The show depicts it as both easily reachable, characters float up fairly often, and impossibly remote, depending on what the story needs. The distance from the ocean floor to the surface is, in reality, significant. Bikini Atoll's lagoon is not that deep, but the surrounding ocean is thousands of meters. None of this is consistent with how the show depicts travel between the two. None of this matters to how the show works or how enjoyable it is to watch. But it does contribute to the feeling that Bikini Bottom is less a place with a fixed location and more a feeling. It's a town-shaped thing, with the properties of a town that exists wherever the story needs it to exist. The geography serves the characters rather than the characters existing within a geography. This is probably exactly what Hillenburg intended. The show's world was never meant to be mappable. It was meant to feel real, to have the weight and texture of a real place, without actually being one. That's a harder thing to achieve than it sounds. Lots of fictional worlds feel like sets. Bikini Bottom feels, at its best, like somewhere you could actually be. The real Bikini Atoll is a ring-shaped reef, an atoll which means it consists of small islands arranged in a rough circle around a central lagoon. The lagoon is where most of the nuclear tests took place. The water inside the ring is calmer and shallower than the surrounding ocean. The seafloor of the lagoon is a different environment from the deep ocean floor surrounding the atoll. If Bikini Bottom is located beneath the atoll, it's most plausibly in the lagoon, in relatively shallow water, with the reef structure above it. This would explain why the sky above Bikini Bottom is bright rather than dark. and why the environment feels more like a reef community than a deep ocean environment. Real coral reef communities have the kind of biodiversity and colour that Bikini Bottom's design evokes. The current state of the actual lagoon is scientifically fascinating, though perhaps not in a way that maps neatly onto SpongeBob's cheerful world. The lagoon floor still has wrecked ships from the nuclear tests, battleships that were positioned there to test the weapon's effects on naval vessels. The ships are now artificial reefs, heavily encrusted with coral and inhabited by fish. The rusting hulks have become ecosystems. Life has moved into the wreckage and made something out of it. This is, metaphorically, what Bikini Bottom is. A community that has moved into the wreckage of the nuclear tests and made something out of it. The cheerfulness is not denial, it's adaptation. The characters don't know what happened there, or they've made their peace with it, or the knowledge has receded over generations until it's just the ground they walk on. This is how communities work in the aftermath of disasters. Eventually, the disaster becomes the place, and the place becomes home, and home is just where you are. SpongeBob has failed his driving test hundreds of times. His neighbour has a documented and deeply felt dislike of him. His boss exploits him fairly consistently, underpays him, manipulates him, occasionally puts him in danger for minor financial gain. His best friend is well-intentioned but unreliable in ways that have caused SpongeBob concrete harm on multiple occasions. His city was created by nuclear fallout, and he has been trying to earn a piece of paper that certifies he can drive a boat for what is, depending on how you calculate it, somewhere between 25 and 30 years. SpongeBob SquarePants is, by most measurable indicators, not doing great, and yet SpongeBob is happy. Genuinely, consistently, apparently, sincerely happy. He loves his job, he loves his snail, he loves his pineapple house and his jellyfish fields, and his best friend, and his routines. He approaches each day with the enthusiasm of someone for whom every day is new and full of possibility. Tom Kenny has talked about this in interviews. He describes SpongeBob as a character who is happy not because he's incapable of being otherwise, but because he is genuinely engaged with small things, in a way that most people stop being able to do somewhere in their 20s. The joy is not performed, it's not a mask. SpongeBob actually loves flipping burgers. He actually loves the specific smell of the crusty crab, and the specific quality of the grease, and the specific satisfaction of a patty done right. He is, in Kenny's framing, someone who has found his thing and gets to do it every day. The contrast with Squidward is intentional and pointed. Squidward wants more than what he has and is miserable. SpongeBob wants nothing beyond what he has and is fine. The show runs both of these as parallel truths without resolving which one is correct. You can watch SpongeBob as an argument for contentment, that being good at something and caring about the people around you is enough for a good life, and that ambition is at least as likely to cause misery as satisfaction is. Or you can watch it as an argument for aspiration, that Squidward's frustration comes from something real, that his talent deserves recognition, and that SpongeBob's happiness is partly a function of not having enough self-awareness to know what he's missing. The episodes where SpongeBob's happiness breaks are the ones that land hardest. When Gary leaves, when SpongeBob comes home to find his pet gone and has to reckon with the fact that Gary went to Patrick because Patrick had something SpongeBob didn't. That episode, Dumped, is genuinely upsetting in a way that a lot of the show's louder moments aren't. SpongeBob's despair in that episode is specific and recognisable. He doesn't know what he did wrong. He just knows something important left. Those moments work because the show has done the work of making SpongeBob's happiness feel real. It's not a cartoon shorthand for a cheerful character. It's something the show has built carefully, across thousands of small moments. SpongeBob being good at his job, SpongeBob being kind to people who aren't particularly kind back, SpongeBob finding something to enjoy in circumstances that would frustrate most characters. His optimism isn't naive, it's earned in the way the show earns it. And that, I think, is the actual mystery at the centre of SpongeBob SquarePants. Not what's in the formula, not why there's a squirrel at the bottom of the ocean, not the nuclear backstory or the broken friendship or the floating timeline. The mystery is, how does he do it? How does SpongeBob SquarePants, in a world with all of those things in it, manage to be happy? And the show's answer, quietly, consistently, across 25 years of episodes is, by caring about the right things, at the right scale, in the right way. By being fully present for the thing in front of him, whatever it is, the fry cook thing, the friend thing, the snail thing. These are enough. It is, depending on how you look at it, either the most optimistic message a children's cartoon has ever sent, or the most devastating one. I can't quite decide which. One thing worth noting about SpongeBob's happiness is how it holds up against the later seasons' treatment of it. In the first 3 seasons, SpongeBob's joy is generally written as genuine, something the show endorses and treats with affection. Occasional episodes complicate it, as I mentioned with dumped, but the happiness is the character's reliable state, and the show presents it as a good thing. In some of the later seasons, particularly in the mid-run period after Hillenburg had stepped back, SpongeBob's enthusiasm starts to become a weapon that the show uses against him more cruelly. He's punished for his optimism more harshly. Characters treat his earnestness as a character flaw more explicitly, and there are episodes where SpongeBob's happiness reads less like a celebration of contentment and more like an inability to process the world accurately. The later seasons occasionally have a mean quality that the early ones don't, and SpongeBob's optimism is the vehicle through which that meanness operates. When Hillenburg returned to the show in 2015, some of that quality improved. The character was treated more gently again. The show's fundamental warmth reasserted itself a bit. This might be coincidence. It might also be what happens when the person who invented a character's emotional world returns to oversee it. The contrast between SpongeBob and Squidward as a moral argument is something the show leaves genuinely open rather than resolving. Both of them are in the same world, both dealing with the same circumstances. One is happy and one is not. The show doesn't say that SpongeBob is right to be happy or that Squidward is wrong to be unhappy. It just shows you both. The viewer gets to decide what they think that means. Most children watching the show probably don't think about this at all, and probably shouldn't. They're watching a cartoon about a sponge who cooks burgers, which is what it is and what it's supposed to be. But the option to think about it is there, built into the structure of the show, available whenever you want it. Hillenburg made something that works at the surface level completely, and also has things going on underneath that you can explore if that's what you're after. That's not a small achievement. Most things work at one level or the other. Getting both right is difficult, and getting both right while also making children laugh about a snail and a clarinet is more difficult still. There's a particular experience that comes with rewatching SpongeBob as an adult that I don't think gets talked about enough. It's not nostalgia exactly, not that warm, slightly melancholy feeling of returning to something from childhood. It's something more active than that. It's the experience of watching something you thought you understood and discovering that you were watching a different thing than the thing that was actually there. The children's and adult versions of the show coexist in the same 22 minutes of footage, and which one you find mostly depends on what you're ready for. All of this was always there. Hillenburg put it there, knowing that children wouldn't see it and adults would, or might, if they were paying a certain kind of attention. I think that's why SpongeBob has stayed. It's not nostalgia that keeps people coming back. It's that the show has more in it than they received the first time. And they know it, and they want to see the rest. And the rest is always there, patient and unhurried, waiting for you to be ready for it. Which is perhaps not a bad quality for a sleep video to have either. The mysteries we've talked about tonight don't all have answers, Some of them, the formula, Pearl's mother, Mrs. Puff's past, will probably stay unresolved. The show has had 25 years to answer them and has chosen not to, which is itself a kind of answer. Some questions are doing more work open than they would be closed. Some characters are more interesting because their histories have gaps, but the questions are worth asking anyway. Not because the answers matter, but because asking them is a way of paying attention to the thing, of taking it seriously enough to wonder about it, of being the kind of viewer who notices that the flower clouds might be boat propellers and that the pineapple spirals are mathematically wrong, and that plankton has been cooking the failure half of a shared recipe for his entire adult life. Bikini Bottom rewards that kind of attention. So does almost everything, if you give it enough of it. We've been in Bikini Bottom for a while now. It's probably quite late where you are. That feels appropriate. There's more we didn't get to. Larry the Lobster has a surprisingly complete backstory for a background character. Patrick has a sister named Sam, who appears briefly in later seasons, and parents who exist but aren't well explained. And the question of how a family of starfish ends up living under different rocks in the same suburban neighbourhood is one I've spent more time on than I'd like to admit. And then there's the show's creation itself as a mystery, in a way. Hillenburg was a marine biology teacher who made a comic book for his students, went to animation school on something of a whim, worked on a show about a wallaby, and then made one of the most successful television programs in history about an optimistic sea sponge who likes cooking. He did this once. He never made anything else. He was 57 when he died, and the thing he made is still going, still watched by children who weren't born when it started, still being discussed by people who grew up with it and haven't been able to let it go. That's not a mystery, exactly. But it is one of those facts that sits in an interesting way when you notice it. He did one thing. The one thing turned out to be enormous. 25 years of Bikini Bottom. SpongeBob SquarePants has under 300 episodes. A movie, then another movie, then another one, then spin-offs that Hillenburg didn't want, and that exist anyway, because that's how these things go once they become big enough. And underneath all of it, the same basic arrangement. A cheerful yellow sponge, a pink starfish under a rock, a grumpy cephalopod in an Easter Island head, a crab who cares about money, a computer marrying plankton who cares about a recipe, a squirrel who chose to stay, and a snail who is probably reading something in the other room. If you made it this far, I hope it was a comfortable 2 hours. There's something nicely fitting about falling asleep during a video about SpongeBob, a show that will always be there when you come back to it, unchanged, the Krusty Krab still open, the formula still secret, SpongeBob still showing up for work. One thing that doesn't come up in these discussions, as often as it probably should, is the music. SpongeBob's score, particularly in the early seasons, is genuinely unusual for a children's cartoon. It draws heavily on nautical and Hawaiian steel guitar sounds, but also on a tradition of library music from the 1950s and 60s that gives certain scenes a very specific period quality. The Tiny Tim song, Living in the Sunlight, Loving in the Moonlight, is only used once, in the pilot episode, Help Wanted. Hawaiian slack key guitar appears constantly. There are steel drums, calypso rhythms, occasionally some quite aggressive surf rock. The composer responsible for much of the show's early music was a man named Nicholas Carr, who's been composing and arranging for SpongeBob since its first season. The library of music cues he and others developed for the show is enormous. Hundreds of pieces, covering everything from comedic stings to genuinely lovely little instrumental pieces that play under quieter moments. Some of these cues have become memes in themselves. Dramatic Chipmunk uses a piece from the film Young Frankenstein's music score. So does the ear rape meme that circulated in the early 2010s. The music works as well as it does because it fits the world Hillenburg created. It's the music of old travel films and Pacific Island cultural exchange and mid-century Americana, which is exactly what Bikini Bottom is a reflection of. A place made of all those influences, sitting at the bottom of the ocean, cheerfully unaware of its own strangeness. SpongeBob's theme song, written by Steven Hillenburg, Derek Dryman, Mark Harrison, and Blaze Smith, and performed by Painty the Pirate, is one of the most immediately recognizable pieces of children's television music made in the past 30 years. The call and response structure, "Are you ready, kids? Aye, aye, Captain," is designed to get children shouting at the television before the episode even starts. It works. It has worked on every subsequent generation that has encountered it. There is something chemically effective about that song that goes beyond normal earworm mechanics. And underneath all of it, under the steel guitar and the calypso drums and the shouted theme song and the library music cues, there's still the ocean. Patient and enormous, and mostly unknowable. The same ocean that Hillenburg spent his years teaching people to care about, encoded in animation and music and the particular yellow of a square sponge going to work in the morning. That's the thing, ultimately. Whatever theories you hold about Bikini Bottom, nuclear or comedic or symbolic or surreal, the ocean at the bottom of all of it is real. Hillenburg's love for it was real, and the best of SpongeBob carries that reality in it, even when everything around it is as far from real as possible. Sleep well.